Pues estamos aquí de vuelta en Negocios Televisión, mirando la economía, qué es lo que ha pasado en 2023, haciendo balance, porque ya saben que estamos muy cerca de terminar el año, y mirando qué va a pasar en 2024. Hay muchos frentes abiertos. Por ejemplo, la economía de Estados Unidos, si va a entrar o no en una recesión después de ese trimestre tan fuerte de un crecimiento económico del 5,2%. Hay que mirar también, por supuesto, a China, una de las principales economías del mundo, y Europa, que muy probablemente acabe el año en una recesión técnica, y además también bancos centrales. Por cierto, que esta semana hay semana de bancos centrales, hoy la reunión de la FED, mañana del Banco Central Europeo, que veremos también qué hacen el próximo año. Para hablar de todo esto, tenemos en la jornada de hoy, aquí en el plató de Negocios Televisión, a Candriam. Hoy nos acompañan, por un lado, Antonio Brender, que es Chief Economist en Candriam, y Florence Pisani, Global Head of Economic Research en Candriam también. Thank you so much to both of you for being here in Negocios Televisión. And I'm going to begin this interview with you, Anton, asking you about the U.S. economy. How would you describe the overall performance of the U.S. economy in 2023, considering factors such as the GDP growth, employment, inflation?
Well, the performance has been surprisingly good, to be frank, because many people, if you remember, were fearing a recession to take place. Actually, it's not only that we had no recession, but the economy got stronger and stronger. As you mentioned, the last quarter growth was at an annual rate of above 5%. So this is really not a recession. That's the first surprise. Second surprise, despite the rebound in growth, inflation has kept decelerating, which is also a positive, I believe, for the US. Third surprise, even with a huge amount of new jobs created, wages have also decelerated. So altogether, it's very difficult to say that it was a bad year for the US. Actually, we tend to believe that it was a very strong year and that the Fed now would like activity to slow down, and the tightening that is in place already should provide for such a slowing down over the next quarter. So the Fed, we believe now, has no reason to tighten further because, as you know, monetary policy acts with many lags, and they just wait to see if the economy slows down. We believe that it will slow down and that a recession can be avoided in the US.
In the US in 2024, you believe that we're not going to see a recession?
We hope that we won't see a recession. The key variable to look at is really employment growth, because the labor market is still a bit too tight. So what we should see, what we tend to expect and what we believe the Fed would like to see over the next quarters is job creations to slow down slightly below 100,000 per month. Right now we're more at 200,000. So you need a slowdown of the economy and a slowdown of job creations. The unemployment rate should move a bit higher, and that will allow the Fed, to say, well, we managed to soft land the economy. So we don't expect a recession for next year in the US, provided employment growth slows down significantly in the coming quarters.
Anton, to what extent do you believe that the fact that the U.S. might be able to avoid a recession is due to, for example, the federal spending that the U.S. government has made this year?
The federal spending that the government has made played a role last year. It played a role, in 2023, to make things clear. It played a role, but mainly at the state and local levels. Local governments have been spending a lot. They collected a lot of money during the pandemic. They've been spending it in 2023. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act have also triggered a huge rebound in manufacturing construction, especially in the semiconductor, electric batteries and vehicles and so on sectors. That was very concentrated, but it also boosted activity. This is also now going to fade. So in 2023, government policy played a role. We believe that this role is going to be much less felt in 2024.
What about China? Because it's been a significant driver of global economic growth. And I wanted to ask you about how has the Chinese economy navigated all the challenges that it's had in 2023, taking into account, for example, the context of government measures or evolving economic priorities?
The performance of China was really very poor. Everybody now has in mind that China is the only big economy who is now challenged by deflation. We fight inflation, they fight deflation. And they fight it in a rather hesitating way and very timid way. The only thing they manage to do is to try to stimulate and spend more on infrastructures. But the local governments, have been already borrowing a lot to invest more in infrastructure. So the central government is also stepping in. we believe that the only positive way out for China would be to stimulate consumption and not more investment. But I'm afraid that the Politburo decisions that were talked about just a few days ago are not really going in that direction. So we believe that the performance in 2023 was poor, and we believe that it will stay poor next year.
Let's talk about Europe now. Florence, I wanted to ask you, how would you assess the economic performance that Europe has had in 2023, taking into account, as I said to Anton, factors such as GDP growth, employment, and inflation?
Well, basically, growth has been pretty lackluster. If you look at consumption, it has been flat. Residential investment has started to turn down. And the only factor of resilience has been a slight pickup of business investment, a normalization of business investment. But altogether, growth will be around 0.5% in 2023. So this is pretty weak growth, and we don't expect growth to accelerate or pick up next year. And the reason for that are obvious. Monetary policy has tightened. It works with some lags. So it's going to continue to curb residential investment. If you look at households borrowing, now it's declining in Spain. It's pretty flat all across the euro area. So altogether, we do expect residential investment to contract next year. Now, if you look at business investment, interest rates have been creeping up. So borrowing cost, interest paid by companies are going to creep up, and some companies are going to postpone their investment plans. And if you look at the macro altogether, with demand weakening, there is no incentive for companies to invest a lot next year. The only thing that is going to slightly pick up and support growth should be consumption. Why? Because inflation is receding, so this should provide a bit of purchasing power to households, and this should allow consumption to grow at 1%. So altogether, if you had contracting residential investment, weak business investment, and a slight pickup of consumption, what we do expect is growth next year to be very close to what it was this year, around 0.5%.
Are you expecting a recession for next year, or even a technical recession already now in Europe?
Well, a technical recession is always possible because we are in a very weak growth environment. So having 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, it's something that could happen. That being said, it's really a technical recession, it's not a recession. We have very weak growth potential in Europe, so we have to get used to those pretty low growth environments. If you look at working age population, it's not contracting in Europe. Without migration, it would be minus 0.5%. And if you look at productivity gains, they have been very weak. Since 2016, we have had 0 growth of GDP per employee. So the potential rate of growth in Europe is likely around 0 or 1% at best. So 0.5% is a growth rate that is very close to potential. So having 2 negative quarters doesn't mean anything.
Let's talk about central banks, because today we have the Fed meeting in the US. Tomorrow we're going to have the ECB meeting. And with the ECB monetary policy in focus, because you already talked about this, I wanted to ask you, how has it influenced inflation and economic stability throughout the whole year? And what adjustments, if any, are you expecting for 2024?
The main way monetary policy is transmitted to the economy is through higher interest rates and higher borrowing costs for households and lower residential investment. So this has worked. If you look at residential investment, it has been curbed. This was on purpose on the ECB side. That was the normal way monetary policy transmits to the economy. So we do believe that the ECB policy has worked. We do believe that the ECB was right to hike interest rates because inflation was way above its target. We now think that the ECB is down. There is no reason for the ECB to continue to tighten. The economy is pretty weak. Inflation is slowly receding. But we do believe the ECB will be very cautious not to cut too quickly. The market now is expecting the ECB to cut as soon as March. We believe it's too soon for the ECB to really cut rates. We believe that the ECB will be pretty cautious. They want to see inflation, especially in the service sector, receding. And if you look at inflation for core services, it's still pretty elevated. I know that if you look at inflation, the latest data were pretty good. The market reacted very positively. But if you look into the details, core good prices are now declining. But this is due to normalization of supply chain tensions that was to be expected. That's good, of course. Energy prices are coming down. But if you look at the core services, service prices are still growing a bit too fast for the ECB. So we think it will take a while for the ECB to be convinced that service prices are receding. So there is no urgency for the ECB to cut, at least not as soon as March.
We'll see if Lagarde tomorrow mentions anything about rate cuts. Probably not, or probably say just that they're not mentioning it or even thinking about it. Anton Brender, Chief Economist at Candriam. Florence Pisani, Global Head of Economic Research at Candriam. Thank you so much to both of you for coming here to Negocios Televisión. Bueno,